When we look at Nehemiah, we see a story of persistence, faith, and the reality of opposition in the work of God. One thing is certain: if you are doing something significant for God, the enemy will try to stop you. Satan always opposes the work of the Lord. If you are on the front lines, expect resistance. Sometimes it comes in the form of ridicule, discouragement, or even outright threats. But when those tactics fail, the enemy gets more subtle. He tries to infiltrate, corrupt, and weaken from within. And that's what we see in Nehemiah chapter 5. Nehemiah had already faced external opposition. The enemies mocked, threatened, and even planned attacks. But the work continued. Now, the attack shifts. It comes from within the people of God. The rich were taking advantage of the poor, charging high interest, and even forcing some into slavery. The enemy used greed and division to try to stop the work. This is a powerful lesson for us. Often, it's not the outside attacks that do the most damage, but the division, selfishness, and compromise within the church that weakens it. Satan doesn't always need to destroy us from the outside. He just needs to plant seeds of pride, greed, or bitterness inside, and we'll do the rest of the damage ourselves. But Nehemiah was a leader who feared God more than men. When he heard about the injustice happening among the people, he was angry. And this is a righteous anger, the kind of anger we should have when we see sin, oppression, and corruption among God's people. He didn't ignore the problem. He confronted it. He called the people together and demanded that they stop taking advantage of their brothers. He reminded them of their calling to walk in the fear of the Lord. And they listened. They repented, they restored what was taken, and the work continued. That is the power of a leader who stands for truth. We need this kind of courage in the church today. Too often, people look the other way when sin is in their midst. They tolerate injustice, greed, and selfish ambition, because they don't want to cause conflict. But Nehemiah understood something: we are responsible before God. Leaders, pastors, and every believer will stand before God one day to give an account of how we led, how we lived, and how we honored His name. Do we fear God enough to do what is right, even when it's difficult? Do we care more about His glory than our comfort? Nehemiah's example also reminds us of the importance of integrity. He refused to take advantage of his position. Though he had the right to tax the people as governor, he chose not to. He lived humbly, served sacrificially, and set an example of what it means to fear God. How different would the church look today if every leader lived with this kind of integrity? If pastors, ministry leaders, and believers in every position refused to exploit others for personal gain and instead lived to serve, the work of God would advance in power. This passage also warns us about the dangers of money, pride, and compromise. Satan often uses these things to destroy ministries. Many great men of God have fallen because they did not guard their hearts against greed, pride, or impurity. When success comes, be even more watchful. The enemy waits for the moment when you start to rely on your own strength instead of God's. He waits until you feel secure, then he strikes. That's why we must walk in the fear of the Lord daily, recognizing that everything we have, every opportunity, every resource, and every success belongs to Him. We are only stewards. The good news is that when we address sin, when we restore what is broken, and when we commit ourselves fully to God, the work continues. In Nehemiah's time, the people repented, and the wall was finished. The enemy tried to stop them, but he failed. God's purposes cannot be undone by the schemes of the enemy. And the same is true today. The church is under attack. There are external forces trying to silence it, and internal struggles that threaten its unity. But if we stand firm, if we refuse to compromise, if we fear God more than men, the work will continue. The church will not be stopped, and God's kingdom will advance. So, let this be a challenge to us all. Are we walking in the fear of the Lord? Are we guarding our hearts against pride, greed, and compromise? Are we standing for truth, even when it costs us? May we be leaders like Nehemiah, committed to the work, unwavering in faith, and determined to honor God above all. And if we do, we will see His hand move powerfully in our lives, in our churches, and in the world. Amen.